Hey everyone, welcome back to my channel. My name is Sam and I hope you're doing really well. And on this channel, I like to talk about all things film, Blu-ray and physical media collecting. So this video is a little different. I'm going to be talking about a specific subject surrounding film and television. I will only be talking about film though here. And that is the subject of violence and screen violence, as it's something that I'm currently studying, and I just thought I'd make a video to just sort of put my thoughts out there to any viewers that may be interested in having a discussion about the aesthetics of violence in cinema and when violence is gratuitous and what that says about viewers when they find that sort of thing enjoyable. For instance, the slasher genre of horror films, which is something that I really love, as you can probably tell from my Friday the 13th jacket here. But I'm still sort of like evolving in my sort of critical appraisal of films that I really love, and sort of getting down to the heart of what it is about violence that is both attractive and repellent at the same time. It's a very paradoxical concept within horror. Like, there's something about horror films, not just horror films, but generally violence tends to be in horror films. What it is about it that is both at the same time is ugly, but at the same time we want to see that on screen. And yeah, so these is just some discussion points, and I'll just show some films that I think are interesting in their depictions of violence, and then hopefully we can have like a discussion in the comments below if anyone's interested to talk about violence. So the first film I want to bring up is a film by Sam Peckinpah, and it's The Wild Bunch. So this is a legendary Western film, very controversial on its release, mainly because of its depiction of violence, which is why I brought it up. This was a turning point in the Western genre. There was a huge amount of uproar in its depictions of violence. A lot of people thought it was very gratuitous. It was the first time that a Western really wasn't sanitized in its depictions of like bloodshed and like guns and people being shot with bullets, basically. Sort of Sergio Leone with like The Good, the Bad and the Ugly, and For a Few Dollars More and things like that sort of maybe pioneered it, but it wasn't until Sam Peckinpah released this film that violence was on full display in this genre of filmmaking. There's a lot to be said about the time period in which this film was released. It was at the end of the 60s and America was in a lot of turmoil. There was civil rights issues and demonstrations happening. The Vietnam War was occurring, and it was just a very tumultuous time in American history. And even though Sam Peckinpah has said that this film isn't a reflection of the times in which America was living, it's very difficult not to see this film through that lens. And yeah, this film is very interesting because it blurs the lines between the good and the bad guys. It's very much sort of like an anti-hero type story in which you're not too sure who is good and who's bad. In fact, pretty much all the characters in these films are horrendously immoral, but you can't help but almost root for some of them in some ways, even though they're despicable people. So it's a very interesting look at that, and definitely the violence in this film is something really interesting to look at, and how it sort of changed the Western genre, changed the way people looked at violence. And yeah, it's really interesting. If you've seen The Wild Bunch, let me know what you think of it. I mean, by today's standards, it's not that shocking. I mean, if you look at it through the lens of people watching it in the 60s, for sure, people walked out of theatres because they were so appalled at the gratuitous levels of violence in this film. But as some people have said, like Quentin Tarantino has said, like the end shootout in this film is like a bullet ballet, and it is very well choreographed and extremely entertaining. But then again, what does that have to say about viewers enjoying that sort of thing? I just find it really interesting. So that's The Wild Bunch. Next up is one of the greatest films of all time, in my opinion, from the legendary filmmaker Fritz Lang, and it's his film M. So you may be thinking, why have I picked M as a film concerning screen violence? Well, if you're not aware of the story of M, without spoiling too much, it is a film that follows the sort of hunt for a child killer. So this film came out in 1931 in Germany. It's a German language film, and there is no violence to speak of, really. There's definitely no children being killed on screen. You don't see any dead bodies of any of the children in it or anything like that. All the violence is implied through plot development and people talking about the crimes that have been committed. And even still to this day, this is such a disturbing film. Even after now, there's films that have such high levels of gratuitous violence that I've seen that don't give me as much chills as what this film does. And that says a lot about what can be shown, what shouldn't be shown, and how you can tell a really good story without having to show the violence. So I'm not making a statement to say that's the way that film should be made all the time, but I'm just trying to highlight a film that is extremely effective in sort of conveying violence that has occurred, but without actually depicting it on screen. And Fritz Lang's M is a masterclass in sort of in that respect. I don't know how else to say it, basically, but yeah, I adore this film. If you've never seen M before, you really should see it. It's one of the crowning achievements of world cinema. It's possibly the best film of the 1930s, in my opinion. And yeah, I love this. Have you seen M? Let me know what you think of it and how its depiction of violence is used by not showing anything but still being extremely effective in the subject of violence. Talking about gratuitous violence, let's talk about something that I really love. Might be a hint by my jacket here, but talking about Friday the 13th. So this is by no means like the originator of like the slasher genre. There's a lot of debate about where that started. A lot of people think it started sort of like in the 60s with some of like the giallo films from like Mario Bava. The boom of American slashers that like took over sort of like theaters in the 80s sort of originated with Friday the 13th, directed by Sean S. Cunningham. Now this is probably not the best example because the first Friday the 13th film is by no means my favorite in the franchise. I do have the big box set up there from Screen Factory, but it's just such a big bulky set. I thought I'd just get the first disc out. But yeah, this sort of really challenged audiences and critics at the time for its gratuitous depictions of violence without any real redeeming quality for a narrative. For the violence didn't really mean anything other than to thrill the audience. It's such a strange concept to find violence on screen enjoyable. It's particularly by the standards from today, looking back on these films, because I view the violence in films such as the Friday the 13th and other slasher films from the era, they're very cartoony. They're very, you can tell that the violence is staged and a construct, and it's not really meant to replicate anything in the real world as such. Although some of the kills in some of these films can seem very lifelike and very realistic. So this very much differs from the last film I showed you, M by Fritz Lang, which shows no violence whatsoever in the film, to a film which has some sort of gory death sequences, all for the viewing pleasure of its audiences. And it's an example of something that how it has maybe aged slightly in like the graphicness of the gore, but it's still something that was made with the intention of thrilling people. And that is such a strange thing when you start to really look into the idea of violence. Like in real life, it's abhorrent. Like people avoid violence and wouldn't inflict it or want it to be inflicted on them, but when you're watching it on screen, there's some sort of vicarious thrill, I guess, happening when you're watching it. But yeah, I still don't know what to make of what I'm talking about. It's why I wanted to open this up to a discussion with people. But I love this film franchise, and I don't think my opinion of it is going to change. But I will be looking at some of these slasher films and horror films that I love through a slightly different lens by sort of assessing my own feelings about why this sort of violence is appealing. And yeah, I don't know where I'm going with this, but I'm rambling, but yeah, on to the next one. Next up is an extremely controversial film that upon its premiere, it had mass walkouts and was derided pretty much across the board by audiences and critics. It has in recent years sort of gathered more critical appraisal, and audiences have it's found its audience, I should say. And it's a film that I personally think is a masterpiece, but it's not a film I would recommend to anybody. And I'm talking about Gaspar Noé's Irreversible. So this is getting, and which I'm extremely excited for, a really cool, or looks to be a really cool edition from Indicator. So the controversy around this film revolves around its portrayal of violence, particularly a very infamous, extended, brutally realistic rape scene. And there are some other instances of extreme violence in this film. What I will say about some of the graphic violence in this film, particularly the infamous rape scene, is that it's filmed in a non-gratuitous way. The point of it is to repel you. There are so many sort of horror films and exploitation films that have used like rape as a narrative point to propel a story, whereas it's not a gimmick of this film, but the way this film is told is in reverse. So it may seem like a gimmick, sort of similar to sort of Memento from Christopher Nolan, but this film really only works if the story is told backwards. I think this film is absolutely incredible, albeit one I won't recommend to anybody because of its extreme content. But if you've seen this and you enjoy this, or you find it interesting or engaging, you know what I'm talking about. But then again, is it ever okay to depict some of the things that are in this film on screen, regardless of how ethical or non-gratuitous in like their manufacture that they are? I don't know, but it's an interesting conversation to have nonetheless. But yeah, that's Irreversible. And last but not least is a film by one of my favorite filmmakers, and he's typically taken a detour in his latter career from away from this style of filmmaking, but this is from 1997. It's Mikhail Haneke's Funny Games. Now this, equally like Irreversible, had like mass walkouts when it was premiered at sort of like the prestigious European film festivals. The film is very much a critique of the thriller and horror genre, but simultaneously being a pretty much perfect example of the genre. So it's one of those dichotomous instances in which a film is sort of critiquing the genre that it's perfecting. In my opinion, it's all personal interpretation. But yeah, this film follows a family who are vacationing at like a lakeside cabin sort of thing. I think they own the cabin, and then basically two intruders come into their home and basically torture them and play games with them, and it's quite a horrendous film to get through. However, the interesting thing about this film is that most of the violence occurs off screen, so you never see anything horrific happen. You only ever see the horrific instances afterwards. And also, one of the intruders speaks to the audience. He breaks the fourth wall and sort of includes the audience in the violence that is occurring on screen to sort of hold us as viewers accountable for the things we are watching and enjoying, which is a very interesting thing. Mikhail Haneke is very vocal about his distaste for American cinema, particularly the violence included in it that was prominent in the 80s and into the 90s, and how basically society is becoming desensitized to violent acts on screen, which in turn is potentially affecting our sensitivity levels in real life. So he's not making a comment that basically watching violence on screen makes you a violent person, but it's basically saying that there's dangers in consuming this sort of media because it can lead to you being desensitized to violence in real life, which is a really interesting thing to think about again. And I don't know whether his experiment in this film is successful. I will say it's extremely interesting and something that I find endlessly fascinating, and this film is entertaining. Although if Mika Haneke heard me say that, he'd probably say that the film has failed in my instance, because he sort of says that if you walk out during the film or you turn it off because you're repelled about what you're watching, then his film has succeeded, because he's trying to make a point that there's too much violence in the media that we consume. And while he's probably correct, I do think there is a balance to be had. Where that balance lies, I don't know. Again, this is all just me opening up for conversation. So that was me rambling for a little while about violence and my thoughts on some films that have violence. Are there any films that you enjoy or don't enjoy that have had a violence in them, or violent scenes, or things that have turned your stomach? Or are there scenes in films or television as well that you found to be violent but warranted or justified? Yeah, I just wanted to just put that out there. Leave a comment, don't leave a comment, please leave a comment, and then yeah, we can have a discussion about it. So until next time, everybody, take care.